Hey guys, Naz here for an airbrushing tutorial. I know a lot of you have been asking about this. Today I'll be covering your airbrushing Minky basics. So I'll start off with what machine I have. It is an Art Logic mini airbrush compressor. The actual airbrush I'm very organised, is a Spar Max. So this is it here. I got it as a package from, I think they're called Hobby Tools Australia. They sold them as a package, I think it was about $300. And you don't need to spend that much. You can go with something as little as a cake airbrush, which is like a tiny little compressor that just runs off batteries. And you can use something as small as that. But I wanted something a bit bigger, a bit more robust to start out with. I use it all the time, so it's really worth the investment if you're going to be airbrushing plushes along. So I've got my airbrush, I've hooked it up to the compressor and I've turned it on. I've cut out the whole 5 minutes for going as the airbrush compressor fills up. So you can hear now it's got air coming out of it. So what I'm going to do to start with is, actually I'll show you what materials I have first. I've got old Windex, which is just a glass cleaner. I've got water in a spray bottle. This isn't for airbrushing. This is just rubbing alcohol. And I've also got my paints. So I was airbrushing a gradient on the cutie mark yesterday, so these are the colours I was using. I use Createx colours, which are professional airbrush paints. I think they ran me about $150 for a set of like 20 different colours, and you only really need a little bit unless you're doing really heavy airbrushing, so I only use a couple of drops at a time. These paints do come with a professional reducer, but personally I can't be bothered to spend that money buying the brand name reducer all the time. I'm pretty lazy and I actually just use Windex. It's probably not the most professional way to go about it, but it works well for me. I get good results. If it's ruining my airbrush, tell me. I'll probably use something else. I used to use rubbing alcohol, but when I was using the Windex because I use the Windex to clean out the airbrush sometimes, I found it made a better reducer than the rubbing alcohol. So just experiment, see what works for you, see what you want to do, what works with your machine. I used to use these paints here. They're called Simply Spray. You can buy them online, and they're just a fabric paint. So they come in a little spray bottle and they're used for tie-dye and kids' parties and things like that. They're good for fabric, but the only downside is you have to get them out of this pressurized can. I usually just shake them up, get a empty glass bottle and spray the whole contents into the bottle, because once that top gets clogged up, it's never going to spray again, and it usually clogs up after one use, because that's all they're made for. They're made for kids' parties and for spraying on a t-shirt once and then chucking away. Another important item in your arsenal is just masking tape. If you're just doing basic stencil work, then masking tape is really good. It's really easy to use. So if you just want to block off and just do one stripe, you can get your masking tape, stick it on your plush, block off the areas that you don't want colour on, and then spray in between. The only downside is you really have to watch the edges of your masking tape, because you might be airbrushing here and you might be getting spray all the way over here. So if you're working on plushes that are vastly different colours, say you're spray brushing black onto a white plush, you might be focusing your airbrushing at this point and have your masking tape here, but on the edge of that masking tape you might be getting slight grey airbrush paint spluttering on them. So what I like to do is, for one, be really vigilant about where your paint is going, because you can ruin a plush by getting paint on there, letting it dry, not realising until it's too late. So what I like to do is get like a garbage bag or something like that, cut a hole in it and only leave open the part that you want to airbrush. So if I was airbrushing this here, and say I just wanted to airbrush the bottom of the feet, I could put the rest of the plush in a bag, then tape around and only leave the part that you want to airbrush, because you probably will get accidental spraying on different parts of the plush if you're not really careful. Another important thing to have around is just either, so I just use some toilet paper or some wipes or something like that, just in case something does spill somewhere, and also to dry the insides and get excess paint out of your airbrush when you're cleaning it out. I also just have a tiny little container to spray my excess into. You can use a milk jug or just a plastic container or whatever you want to use. Just using common sense, I would really recommend just putting either plastic or newspaper down on the surface you're working on. Don't airbrush in a room with white carpet or something like that. I'm in a rental, so I have to be really careful that I don't get any paint on the floor. Working up on this surface, I haven't had any paint spillages, and if any paint goes onto the table, it's just absorbed by the newspaper. Another really good investment is an airbrush holder. It's really not easy to put an airbrush down when it's got paint in it. I actually lost the lid off like my little paint container ages ago, and I haven't been able to find it, and I haven't been bothered to go and buy a new one because it's just a lid. So you really need to get something to hold the airbrush. You can't just lean it on something. They're a really odd shape. So I actually spent, I think it was $15 to buy this proper airbrush holder. It's got a couple of slots. They rotate it. Your paint, your airbrush isn't going to go anywhere. Your paints aren't going to spill anywhere. And I also put them in there when I'm mixing paint in the cup. I really can't say that I'm an airbrush expert, but when you're looking for buying your first airbrush, I would recommend the top feed if you're just doing small jobs, which is what I do. The bottom feed ones are the ones that have like the big glass or the big plastic screw-ons down the bottom, and your paint feeds from those. You're not going to be needing that much paint. You're only going to be using a small amount of paint depending on how big your plushie is. The top feed has worked really well for me, so it just depends what you're in the market for, what you have available, and what works for you and your projects. So now we'll get on to our actual airbrushing. Now that you have your airbrush, once it's plugged in, you've got the air working and flowing nicely, the first thing I do is I'm just going to spray a tiny little bit of Windex in there to make sure that it's spraying properly and just to clean it out and to lubricate it a little bit. If you want to wear a ventilation mask, you can. I have one, but I don't find the paint fumes too toxic from this airbrush, and I always leave my windows open when I'm working. Now that we've got our airbrush ready for use, we're going to prepare what we're going to be airbrushing. So I just found whatever I had to airbrush on the floor, and I have lots of anthro bodies. So this was the only white one that I made, so I decided I'm going to be airbrushing this. So I apologise if you don't enjoy looking at plush booties and plush abs and such, but it's white, and white is pretty easy to airbrush. It'll be easier for you guys to see what I'm doing. First off, you're going to work out what part of the plush you're going to be airbrushing. I'm not going to do a really specific pattern or anything, I'm just going to show you guys the basics. So I'm going to airbrush this bottom leg. I'm not going to worry too much about the rest of the plush in this case because I don't care what happens to this. This is just an example. So you would pick out what part you want to airbrush, take the rest of it off, cover the rest of it if you want to, and then you're going to get your paints ready. So I've chosen my colour. I'm just going to get a bright orange, so hopefully you guys can see this. I'm going to shake the paint first, and then I'm just going to go put a few drops into the top feed of my airbrush. And I'm just going to get a little bit of Windex, just put a couple of squirts in there. Your dilution rate doesn't really matter too much, just whatever works for you. I just usually do a few drops of colour to just a squirt of Windex. It really doesn't matter, as long as you're getting paint coming nicely out of the airbrush. It doesn't really matter what ratio you use. Probably best to leave it a little bit on the thin side so you don't clog up your airbrush. Now we're going to just get a test piece of paper. You can see what mine looks like after an airbrush project. White piece of paper, and we're just going to test that the colour is the right colour and that it's coming out at a good speed and a good consistency. So the colour that came out didn't come out as bright as I thought it was going to be, so I've just added a couple more drops so that the colour is as thick as I want it. So we're going to start airbrushing. I'm just going to put my airbrush in its little holder. You're going to brush down the nap of your minky, making sure that there's no fluff or anything on it, because that fluff will act as a stencil and you might get accidental little white patches that you don't want. So now that we've smoothed the leg off, the minky is sitting how we want it to sit. Now we're going to get our airbrush. And what we're going to do, when you're using the airbrush, you push down for air and you pull back for paint. I usually just use it as at full blast because I usually don't do very detailed work. It's usually just broad gradients. There are plenty of tutorials on how to use your airbrush online. Definitely check out YouTube because my airbrush might not work the same as your airbrush. When you're airbrushing, you don't want to start off, I'm going to do a test on this wrong leg. You don't want to start off right in here using your airbrush because you're going to blow the nap out of the way and you want the nap to stay down. So you want to sort of avoid blowing really strong air up close onto the nap, because that's just going to send it in every direction. You also won't get that smooth effect that you're looking for if you want to airbrush a gradient onto your plush. So I'd recommend probably starting about 10 inches away from what you're airbrushing. Probably do some tests on paper so that you understand how much paint and what diameter is going to come spraying out of your airbrush first. So I'm going to start at the bottom. I'm going to put my air on, pull the trigger back for paint, and I'm just going to move the airbrush from side to side, because if you stay still for too long you're going to get build-ups and spots. So we just want a light gradient. I would recommend, if you're airbrushing downwards, be really careful that paint doesn't drip off your airbrush and onto the plush, because that can happen. What you want to do is start your airbrush off the plush and end your airbrush off the plush, because that start and end point is where you're most likely to get spluttering. So we'll do a little bit here. After you finish your airbrushing, clean your airbrush out straight away, because leaving paint in there is the best way to get a clog. So I'm going to just use some water to rinse out the top, and just keep rinsing it out until the water's relatively clear, then blast it out the front to clear up any paint that's still left in the needle. And I usually tap the front just to blow some air back into it, and that usually pushes any clogs, just any little clogs out of it. So now that we've got our first layer on, I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but there is an orange gradient going up. We need to dry this layer. This is the key to keeping your plushes really soft. Don't put a lot of paint on all in one go. It might be tempting to get it done quickly, but it's going to make your plush bristly and not really feel very good. It's mostly down to what paint you use and what technique you use. So I find that... You're up there, Carl? He's talking to himself. I find that if you just do a light layer and then use this handy tool, you might have heard of it before, you just use this on a low setting. Don't put it too close to your plush, because you don't want to melt the nap of your plush, but just put it on a low setting, and we're just going to air dry the feet of that plush and get that layer dry before we start on the next layer. You're going to find that every time you blow dry a layer, it's going to become a lot more opaque and a lot lighter than when you put it down. This is normal. Most paints are going to dry a bit lighter than what you put them down, because when you first put them on, they're still a bit wet and they're going to retain that darker colour. So we've dried this. Now we're going to move on to our second layer. Now I've cleaned my airbrush and I've blow dried this plush, and I think that that orange gradient is where I want it at the moment. You can do more layers if you need to get a darker colour, but just do the minimum amount that you need, because the less layers you use, the softer your plush is going to be. This job's probably not perfect, but it gives you a good idea of what you can achieve. I've only spent about 5 minutes doing this, and I've already got the gradient to a pretty good level. I could probably be a bit pickier with how even the gradient is, but that's just up to your artistic eye, and it's up to you to pick out where more paint needs to go, where there's missing patches, what needs to be more soaked and what needs to be left alone. This was just a quick job. I probably only took about 5 minutes to do this, so if you want to airbrush your plushes, take more care than me and actually spend more than 5 minutes doing your gradients. One thing that I would also mention is to probably put your hair up if you have long hair, and don't wear any clothing that you care about getting paint on it, because you most likely will get paint on whatever you are wearing at your time of airbrushing. Airbrushing can be tricky when it comes to what colours you can airbrush onto other colours. The rule of thumb generally goes you can airbrush darker colours onto lighter colours. You can't really airbrush light colours on dark plush. I have seen people do this, but I'm not really sure how thick the paint goes on and whether it's still smooth to the touch. When you're airbrushing, I would recommend starting off with the darkest variant of your pigment. So if you're wanting to airbrush a sky blue onto a white plush, start off with a darker blue so that you can get that light blue that you want in fewer layers, and that will keep your plush softer. As far as airbrushing different colours onto different colours goes, you're just going to have to experiment. Always test on a scrap piece of Mickey first so that you can see how the colours combine and whether it works or not. If you want a radical colour change, you're probably going to have a hard time, Airbrushing an entire plush a different colour is really, really hard, especially if you want to keep that plush soft. It's really hard to keep the evenness of colour over the whole plush, so be very cautious about airbrushing large areas. When I'm wanting to do complex designs on my plush, I usually make little templates or stencils. I try not to use paper or cardboard because the cardboard and paper will absorb the paint and it can end up becoming like a stamp as you press it down onto your plush. I would far more recommend using hard plastic or something that propels water. It might be harder to cut into, but the stencil will last for a lot longer. When using a stencil repeatedly, always be cautious of the underside of the stencil. Make sure that no paint has built up on the underside of the stencil as you keep pressing it down and spraying on top. To combat this, I usually just keep some toilet paper or paper towels around. Every time you use the stencil, dab it down on that paper towel and that will absorb any extra paint that's left on the stencil. If your airbrushing project seems too difficult to attempt on your own, consider using something like Spoonflower, who offer custom printed Minky instead. It might not be as long a pile and as soft as the normal Minky you will buy, but it'll certainly be a lot easier if you want photorealistic airbrushing. I just realised I've been stroking the bum of this plush the entirety of this section. If you do accidentally get paint on a part of your plush that you don't want it, you have to take action immediately, especially if it's a very different colour change. Once that paint dries, there's really no way of getting it out of your plush, so be committed if you're going to airbrush a finished plush, and know that if you mess it up, that's there permanently and you either have to make the plush again or deal with those mistakes. My first course of action would be take that plush straight away to your kitchen sink, get a clean cloth and dampen it. Don't spread the paint because that's just going to make things worse. Try and just dab that paint out. Just using cold water. Don't use hot paint because Don't use hot water because that will probably set the paint even further. Keep using different clean cloths, toilet paper, kitchen towels, etc. and just keep dabbing with water and try and lift that stain out. You can also try using something like Windex or a tiny little bit of dishwashing detergent. Just be really careful when you're doing this because if you rub it in too hard, that can damage the nap of your plush permanently. This is why I would recommend practicing before you actually airbrush your finalised plush. When airbrushing, I would really take care to monitor your seams. When you're airbrushing gradients over seams, it can be easy to leave the seams and then you'll have a big stripe in the colour of your original nap. So really focus on looking at those seams, making sure your paint is getting into those. Also be very careful if you're airbrushing around embroidery. Airbrush paint loves to get into the whites of embroidery, so really watch that because once that gets into your embroidery, it's probably not going to come out anytime soon. As for whether you want to airbrush on a flat piece of pattern or a stuffed and completed piece of pattern, it's up to you. These days I tend to airbrush when the plush is already stuffed. You can get a better control of where markings and gradients are going to go because when your pattern is flat you don't necessarily know what points are going to correlate with what points on the finished plush. This is especially important if you're airbrushing markings like on a zebra or something of that nature. You want to be able to span and have your airbrushing match up across seams and on different bulges of fabric. An airbrush and compressor is an awesome tool for your plushing arsenal and I would really recommend getting one. You don't have to spend a fortune and you can get really cool results. Overall, I would just recommend to practice and don't necessarily start off with a finished plush. Practice airbrushing on flat pieces of Minky, practice airbrushing on test patterns and such until you're confident with your machine and your abilities. In the likely event that I've missed something about airbrushing, which I probably have, feel free to message me on Patreon if you have any questions. Take the time to do as I've said, airbrush lightly, use a darker colour to have less layers, and always dry between layers so that you can get a nice soft plush as your finished result. If you have any subjects you'd like me to cover or any tutorials you'd like to make, or even little questions that you'd like me to answer in a video, feel free to leave a comment below. Thanks guys!